Oh, good afternoon, friends. How are you? I apologize. You've caught me in the middle of planning a lesson for my classes tomorrow. Well, hopefully tomorrow if we get what we missed yesterday done today. In any case, my apologies, for I know some of you and have heard much of all of you, and yet have forgotten to introduce myself. Allow me a polite introduction. My name is Anne Wager, teacher of the Williamsburg Bray School. In this year of our Lord, 1769, my school is, well, the first official school for blacks in this colony of Virginia, slave and free. Although I must say about 9 out of 10 of my students are slaves, every 1 or 2 being free. In any case, for the past 9 years, I have taught at this school spelling, writing, reading, ciphering, account keeping, sewing and knitting, not surprising since over half my students are girls. And above all, I do all of this to teach and bring to light to these children the principles of our established church here in Virginia, the King's Church, the Church of England. On the subject of students, though, in fact, on the subject of schools, it has come to my attention that you particularly wish to speak with me about the education of my female students, and indeed, the education of the fairer sex in general in Virginia. And as I know of this, since the trustee for my school, Mr. Nicholas, requested I speak with you, I could not think of a topic I am more interested in, perhaps, albeit I am a little biased myself, being a female teacher. But truly, it is a universal and important topic here in Virginia in 1769. Above all, though, I must admit that what I have encountered when it comes to women's education is that it is just and diverse and varied as anyone else's. And while education for the fairer sex can be divided by one's sex, one's gender, it is not the only dividing point when it comes to female education. One's race, one's class, whether you are a lady, a servant, a slave, or a teacher. All of these impact not only what education you receive, but how you utilize it. Now, to that point, though, I could lecture on since I get very excited about this topic. But I do so hate lecture, don't you? And I would much rather use some of the textbooks that I use in my own school to highlight these points, since I feel they may be clearer that way. In particular, the book you caught me reading as you joined me is called Dixons' English Instructor. Dixons' English Instructor is indeed the spelling book that I currently use at the Bray School, a very common spelling book in general across North America, as the book was designed by the Church of England to spread Christian faith across the colonies. And naturally, the first lessons are the alphabet, monosyllabic words, teachings of tiny things, followed by 180 pages of the doctrine of the Church of England. Regardless, this book has been used for students white, black, free, and enslaved throughout Virginia, not just at my school. And this highlights my point about education. While literacy may be provided to many, especially in Williamsburg, where it's, quite frankly, has a fairly high literacy rate, but the execution of that literacy may be different from person to person. Here's what I mean specifically. I used a similar book to Dixons' English Instructor to teach the children of the Burrell family, a gentry family, teaching young girls who would be ladies. Similarly, I used this book myself as a girl, and I am now using this book to teach my black female students. So we are all learning to read, spell, and write, but the application is not the same. I, by Virginia standards, would just be considered a woman. I'm not a lady. Not that I have any issue with that, nor is it due to my manners or temper, but I don't have the right last name. I wasn't born into the right family with a proper dowry of thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves to be given to me on my marriage. In effect, my status in society dictates not so much what I may learn, although this can certainly be the case, but more how what I learn will be executed. As an ordinary woman, I learned to read and to write, but for the purpose of, if my husband passed away as he did several years ago, to be able to take care of myself, Apprenticeships often encourage reading and writing for the same purpose with women. And similarly, my students are often encouraged to learn reading and writing by their masters and mistresses because Williamsburg is a city, the capital city of Virginia, and anyone who is anyone has slaves, laundresses, and cooks to tend to their needs who must know how to read and write. To that point, though, when it comes to education, I have found that there is a difference between schooling and education. They are similar, but not quite the same. And while my female and my male scholars are schooled, they certainly have education beyond what I teach them. Indeed, I myself am a perfect example of this. My mother gave me this book when I was a young girl. It is called The Complete English Brewer. And I know you will laugh. Why, Mrs. Wager, you say, are you bringing up beer brewing in a class or a conversation on education? And yet, I will tell you, household management, knowing how to butcher a hog, knowing how to brew beer, this is woman's work. White English women who manage their households must know how to conduct it and must know how to conduct it specifically because their black female domestics are the ones doing the labor. Well, I put to you, if you were not in Williamsburg that had a good system of wells and fresh water, and you needed small beer, something of less than 2% because your well has gone dry and you have no water, what's more important? How well you can spell the alphabet or whether you can brew beer? I let my case stand. But certainly, in addition to the idea of education and schooling and what that means, I would be remiss if I did not express that I am not the only teacher here in Williamsburg. While I am one of the few female teachers, certainly, that doesn't mean that my female students' education ends when they stop speaking to me. Indeed, many of them go on in their own communities to do things that, well, quite frankly, 9 years ago when I opened the school, I never anticipated. Best case in point has to be this book, the Book of Common Prayer. It is a religious text that was built by our established church so that one could practice and worship at home, often with one's mother or the female head of house, guiding the children in this instruction. Well, the Book of Common Prayer is used in my classroom too. Indeed, I have used it with several of my students, like Clara B. and Hannah. And yet I know Clara B. went back with her Common Prayer book when she left the school, spoke with her brother Isaac B., who had also been at my school, and then spoke with their father, John Insco B., who proceeded to tell them about how this could be applied to Quaker practices, which if you know anything about the Church of England, the Quakers and the Anglicans don't get along. Suffice to say, each one of these texts demonstrates that not only are women educated, but how they apply this can vary drastically, community to community, household to household. And with that, I digress. I'm starting to act as if I do in my classroom, lecturing you, and I already said that I hate that. And I would much rather have a conversation with you. Socratic method, that of dialogue, is so much more preferable to me. For those who know me, you know this is the case. So, I have heard that Mr. Smith has some questions to direct to me, and I will do my very best to answer them. Mr. Smith, are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Mrs. Wager. It's a pleasure having you here this afternoon. It's a pleasure hearing from you as a teacher, as a human, and your perspective on all things related to the upbringing of children.
Thank you.
We have people watching from around this country and around the world. We have people watching from California, Illinois, Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, Pakistan, and I think a good starting question that can get us all on the same page is, throughout your time teaching, what is the one thing that has surprised you most about women's education?
I think the one thing that has surprised me the most about female education is that often when people visit Williamsburg, they assume that women do not have education. This could not be further from the truth. Who is conducting work at home? Wives, mothers, those who are slaves. And I myself learned how to read and write at an early age from an English charity school for white children, similar to the Bray School, but slightly different. I must know how to read and write to represent myself in court as a widow. My students learn how to read and write, let me tell you, for a variety of reasons from my uncovering. And yet, time and time again, I've encountered that people are surprised when they discover that not only do I have education as a free white English woman, but that women of all different backgrounds, creeds, and races also receive education. It's an interesting concept to consider, I suppose. I hope this answers your question.
You spoke for a moment about education between slices of society.
Yes.
Your students are slaves, other children who might need to be educated might be educated by their gender or by their station. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about an education for a lady as opposed to a woman?
Most certainly I may, and indeed it is a good question, for truth be told, I brought it up and I must be more explicit. Now, there are some similarities between women's education and ladies' education, from my understanding and observation. I learned to write, read, spell, sew, knit. The young charges I had at Carter's Grove, the Burrell girls that I mentioned, also learned how to read, write, take care of accounts, sew, knit. One of the greatest differences, though, is not only one's sphere, but how that relates to scale of things, as well as who is present in your house. Here's what I mean by both of those things. As to scale, I manage my own household, surely, and it is a busy bit of business on my hand. But I have a tiny house I take care of, you see. The Burrell girls will be expected to marry into the gentry, the elite, and manage thousands of acres of property. I know ladies who help manage 50, 60, 70,000 acres in addition to a house. That is a massive undertaking. And to that point, when one is of such an echelon, the people that sit at one's dining room table are the elite of the elite. And as the lady sits at the head of the table, women in general do, in fact, in the dining room to lead business, you have to have something interesting to say, don't you? Otherwise, how will you keep up conversation amongst the elites at your table and ensure that you remain in that station? One other thing, though, that should not be forgot when it comes to ladies' education, and it is similar to women but slightly different, is the training of management of slaves. Now, I can't afford my own slaves. I rent them, indeed. But anyone who is a lady will have some understanding of management of slaves. Indeed, many ladies are gifted slaves rather than land as their dowry, since in this year of our Lord 1769, both are considered property. And so slave management on a large scale is certainly part of a lady's education. I hope that answers your question.
Well, so speaking of enslaved people's education as it is connected with your job as a teacher and at the Brace School, Tina is wondering, with the exception of a cook who might need to read recipes, why would a female enslaved person need to learn to read?
Tina, this is a fine question. And I must confess, I will do my best to answer it as I may. Although I would recommend, if you ever come to our city of Williamsburg, you ask some of the free black laundresses that question yourself, like Miss Cumbo and Miss De Rosario. And actually, that brings me to my point. There is not a hefty, but a considerable population in Williamsburg, Virginia, Norfolk more so, but in Williamsburg of free blacks. And often the free black women of this city are the ones who are managing household laundry. I don't do my own laundry. I send it out to Elizabeth De Rosario. And when I do so, I write her specific instructions of what I want done in case I am not present when she picks it up. Well, she must know how to read to conduct her business and manage her own account book, ciphering. This is just one of many examples. But when it comes to literacy, I find I must also bring you back to the Book of Common Prayer, to make the book talk back, to speak with and for the Bible. This is, while I may not always agree with Gowan Pamphlet, he's one of Mrs. Vaube's slaves. That's a Baptist. And they actually almost don't get along with the Anglicans worse than the Quakers. But in any case, his congregation, which certainly has women in it, wish to read and understand the Bible. It is part of their community. Who am I to deny them that? It's one of the reasons that I teach at the school, and one of the reasons I know that some of my students wish to learn to read. There are many, many more reasons, but do not be surprised that the free black women of this city know how to run businesses, and they need reading and writing for that. I hope this answers your question, Tina.
Thank you, Mrs. Wager. We have several questions surrounding women and education, as well as slavery and education. Angie wants to know, what was the duration of your education, and what is the duration of your students' education?
Angie, you've asked a very specific question, and I most appreciate it. For indeed, you've highlighted a point that I think I tried to make, but much more eloquently than I ever did, which is that one's individual experience may be very different from another's. I, myself, went to Eton Charity School in Hampton. It's about 30 miles down the road. I mentioned it is a Church of England charity school, and actually still is in existence. But it's meant specifically for white Anglican children. Religious texts, reading, writing, sewing, literacy, as I mentioned, to bring me to the Church of England. Indeed, I believe that my devotion to the church at large is because of my education at Eton. And I was there from the time I was about, I think 7, to when I was 16. Not as long as others mind, but not bad. This differs drastically from many of my students. The free black students I have, their parents, who are the only parents that have control over them at the school, keep their children in the school for 3 or 4 years, which is what our rules request. That being said, when it comes to those girls who are slaves, they are learning similar things that I did at Eton, but I'm lucky to get them for 6 months to a maximum of 2 years. I've only ever had a few that actually stayed for the 3. And even then, I could not get them every day of the week when I was supposed to have them. This has a great deal to do with not just access to education, but access to one's self. I am a free, white English woman. I have rights under the law. I have the right to representation, the right to property, the right to petition my government. My students are property, or by the law, they are defined as property, which means that whether they wish to stay in a school or no, they have no say. And I think that distinction drastically should show you that not only what my education versus my students is like, but why. I hope that answers your question.
So, talking about your students who are enslaved and who are of African descent, what are the benefits of a master, of the owner of that student? What are the benefits of them sending that student to you versus what are might be the negative effects of having that person away from their master?
I see that the question herein gets to the crux of the issue of education, which is that everyone has an opinion on it. Sometimes the opinion will change not only from household to household, but what you've eaten for breakfast that day. And so, to be honest, while I can make sweeping generalizations, I should be also very clear that each individual slave owner, as well as the slaves or the free blacks that are sent, have their own distinct opinions on education. But broadly speaking, if you're not a Blair or a Nicholas, or even Randolph, and you want to send for religious purposes to make your slaves more obedient, which really is what the Church of England espouses. The school is designed to make slaves more obedient and faithful to their place. Well, let's say if you're a Mrs. Campbell or a Mrs. Vogue, you literally increase the property value of your property if they know how to read and write in a city. Any slave who can read or write here is worth more money if you want to sell them in front of the Raleigh. That being said, the point with which you brought up, what are the disadvantages? I think we must... I was surprised one day when I had a conversation with one of my students, Clara B. She was always an interesting child in school, and I said one day, "You are most disagreeable, Clara." She looked at me and said, "Well, that's what you think. I think I'm very clever." And it occurred to me that Clara may be taking very different things and principles out of this school than the masters or mistresses, and may have very different opinions on whether they are positive or negative. But decidedly, what I have encountered with the students is that they have their own reasons for going to the school, but are far too smart to tell me. This school supports the institution of slavery. If they told me anything, I'd have to tell their masters and it would shut down. So we just agree to not say anything to one another. So you simply must ask my students, I suppose, when you visit. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you. Pam wants to know if the students have to pay, if the masters, I suppose, have to pay to send their owned property to school.
Technically, yes, and yet I have never seen a pound, shilling, or pence. My school is funded by the Bray Associates, which is one of the largest charities within the Church of England, designed specifically for the instruction and Christianization of blacks and mulattoes, those of mixed race, throughout the colonies. Now, when my school was established 9 years ago in 1760, the trustees at that time, Reverend Dawson and Mr. Hunter, tried to start a subscription for my salary, since I get paid the same to teach 30 black children as I could get paid to teach one white child in Norfolk, to give you, well, finance for a matter. And yet, it's been 9 years. They have not supplemented me, at least in a monetary way. I have found when something is fraught with different opinions, as we were just discussing with my students versus their masters versus the church, that people tend to tolerate it a little bit more if it's free. Have you ever encountered that with something? I'm sure you have. This means, while I don't get paid as much as I would like, my school, since it is sponsored by the Church of England, can operate outside of a master's or mistress's desires, whether they are related to religion or no. And in some ways, this, well, protects me, or allows me to use the textbooks in a way that perhaps if they were funding the school, I might not. Let's put it that way. I hope that answers your question.
It's perhaps for some of our viewers and audience members, seemingly lesson in contradictions, and perhaps maybe uncomfortable, or at least they're maybe not accustomed to viewing a church who not only allows for slavery, but funds for education of slaves, so as to, I suppose, even increase their value to the master.
Indeed. And this contradiction, friends, I am aware of. I'm sure in your own experience, you find things that are contradictory, that you think, perhaps I ought not do that, but I really can't think of a way around it. The reason I am speaking so frankly to you is because I would never talk this way to any of my neighbors. My school is simply just a situation where we just don't ask. And that's actually why I appreciate you being here, asking such specific questions, for I am sure that if our conversation were to get out into Williamsburg at large, they'd shut the school down, since it is such, well, just because it's legal to teach blacks to read and write in Virginia does not make it popular. The legality of something and its popularity are often not intertwined, for the very reason you have brought up, that you see contradiction. And yet, I appreciate that we may discuss that, for I myself am usually the only one ruminating upon it and cannot discuss it with my neighbors, for the very reason that it will make people uncomfortable. So I appreciate you being here, considering it.
We have two questions from Susie, and Susie wonders, first, what is the average age of your students on a young end or on the older end? And also she's wondering, as an educator, are you allowed to marry?
So I find with my students that the youngest I ever have in a classroom, in fact this year, is 3. The oldest is 10. Now I don't have to tell you, Susie, how you teach a 3-year-old versus how you teach a 10-year-old are very different. But oftentimes I will take the older ones and have them instruct the younger ones, which is an education unto itself, almost like the art of beer brewing. Many of the girls who are in the school, we expected to be domestics in households, taking care of their masters' or mistresses' children. So this is good practice. But most of my students, I find, are about 6 or 7, when you would yourself send your own children to school. As to whether or not I may marry, I was married for many years to the love of my life, Mr. Wager. When he passed away, I suppose I did not anticipate it, but I found that my ministry, my calling, was to teach, and specifically to end up teaching at this school. I'm certainly not barred from marrying again, but some of the privileges I have as a widow would be subsumed under my husband unless I went to chancery court. The entire legal affair fascinates me, but is complicated. Furthermore, well, I run my school 7 days a week. And as I am not looking to replace my husband and insult the Lord by finding someone less than who he first gave me, I see this school as my ministry now. I don't know of many husbands who would encourage me managing our own household and maybe having to have more children and running a business 7 days a week. So I've made my decision to stay at this school. I may change my mind, but no man has impressed me yet to do so. I hope this answers your question.
If there are any people watching who are teachers, they can perhaps understand that sometimes you feel married to that particular profession.
Indeed you do. I get up at 4:30 every morning, and I don't go to bed till 10 o'clock at night, and my classes start at 6 a.m. in the spring and the summer, 7 a.m. at the fall and the winter, and because the Church of England pays for my school, Sundays are the busiest days. Well, I don't have to tell you. You all understand.
So speaking of marriage and rights of women, which you were just speaking of as things become a bit fluid, whether you're a femme sole or femme covert, Jamie is wondering, are women allowed to own property, like land or slaves, if they widow? Must they sell or remarry to have these things?
A fine question and a complicated one. And I must issue the caveat that just like with education, it varies based not only on your sex, but on your race and your social station. The amount of things that ladies can get passed through in legislation or the connections that they have may perhaps afford them even more additional privileges than what I as a woman have. That being said, as a free white English woman, I have privileges. I do have the right to hold property as a widow, a femme sole. I have the privilege to own my own property, to make and break my own contracts, to represent myself in a court of law. Now, if I were married, these would be subsumed under my husband, but you can issue joint suits together. And before your husband is to sell any property in Virginia, you must be petitioned separately by the court to give your assent, whether land or slaves. Slaves in particular are a tricky matter. Yes, women own slaves, decidedly. Almost 40% of the people who send me students to the school who are slaves are, well, women, business women in this city. But again, the distinction here, I find, are connections. Sometimes prenuptial, pre-marriage contracts, also called sometimes jointure settlements, or other agreements in court are made amongst the very elite, ladies' fathers to their new son-in-laws, to protect property. I have found, and perhaps it is not exactly fair, but it is honest, that less people fear the wicked, wicked stepmother than the greedy, greedy son-in-law. And as there are so many blended families in Virginia with the death rates, often ladies of prominence, can use this to their advantage in court. I, as a woman, never felt the need to get a pre-jointure or a jointure or a prenuptial contract, but it is a possibility. You also have chancery court, which is an equity court separate from common law, in which actually certain households in Williamsburg, mostly of businessmen and tradesmen and tradeswomen, can separate their properties so that even after they are married, the tradeswoman can keep her millinery business, for example, and the tradesman can keep his silversmithing business, just as an example. We must not ignore, though, within law that I'm only at this point speaking of free white English women. Black women have a very different experience, and black slave code laws drastically impact this, whether you are free or you are not. For example, no black person under any situation may petition or speak against any white person in a court of law, just as an example. Black women are considered taxable by law. They must pay tithes on their own body when I am not taxable. It is a distinction of prominence, you understand, through taxes. I could go on and on and on, but I hope you get the point. Legislation, just like education, and its impact on different women is as varied as the day is long. I hope that answers your question.
I'm wondering, Mrs. Wager, we have several questions, but not a great deal of time. I'm wondering if we could perhaps work quickly through several questions.
I would be happy to do so.
I deeply enjoy your lengthy answers, the context they give, but...
But I tell you, you know I have this bad habit, Mr. Smith. I get so excited, and then I don't stop talking.
It comes with being a teacher, I suspect.
Well, not all teachers, but certainly me.
So Pam wants to know, you mentioned knitting early on.
Yes.
Pam wants to know, what sorts of things might you knit?
Well, you could knit mittens. Mostly I find that scarves or shawls are appropriate, although I must admit I do more needlework with my girls than with knitting, if I'm being entirely frank, because the marking or practicing a marking stitch to put onto pillowcases or shifts that are being sent out to a free black laundress, I find that's more useful for my students. So there is a little bit of knitting, mittens, scarves, shawls, etc., but I do more marking and needlepoint work.
Jana, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, but Jana wants to know, did you teach sampler making to young women?
Yes, Jana, indeed, I do teach sampler work. In fact, that's often how my girls learn to write, needle and thread versus slate and pencil.
Teaching to write through needle and thread.
Indeed so. Trust me, I'm sure as Jana knows, if you stitch out the alphabet 4 times on a sampler, you will know the alphabet by the end of it, will you not?
Moving to a more domestic topic, Erin, first of all, sends her condolences to the loss of your husband.
Thank you.
And she's wondering how you and your husband met.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about it now. Very young. In fact, that was one of the reasons I left my charity school. We knew each other through mutual acquaintances. The Wager family and the Watts family and the Hatton family, who my daughter has married into, all grew up in Hampton. I met him when I was quite young, in fact, but I didn't really notice him until I turned 16. And I remember looking at William and thinking, at 16, I will marry you. And we were married in a year. So I don't know if he had any say in the matter, or if he had noticed me beforehand. But by the time I turned 16, I noticed him. I hope that answers your question.
Well, speaking of great influences on your life, Lindsay is wondering, who influenced you to become a teacher?
Oh, what a fine question. I've never been asked this question before. And perhaps Mr. Paris would be most pleased by it. But I have to say my teacher, Mr. Paris, at Eton Charity School, he detested me. I was the child that would never stop asking questions. I'm getting paid for it in kind now at my school. But the fact that he would patiently take a deep breath and say, "Yes, Anne, what is your question?" Well, I never stopped asking them. And I suppose it was my teacher that, when I eventually realized I needed an occupation after my husband's death, inspired me to take up teaching. I hope that answers your question.
We only have time for maybe 2 more questions. So Kelly is wondering about what you teach. Not only the topics and subjects, but how do you decide, or do you decide, what is important to teach?
This is a fine question, and often I must use my expertise to discern in a classroom of 30 students where I don't know if I'll have all 30 or what configuration. Are we doing sampler work today? Are we practicing etiquette? Are we working on the catechism, the beliefs of the Church of England? But when it comes to actual textbooks, those are determined for me by my trustees and the associates of Dr. Bray. I have almost 24 different texts that I can pick from, ranging from Dixons' English Instructor, as I have mentioned, to Bacon's Sermons, to Slaves and Slave Owners, to a Letter to an American Planter. It's a text that the Bray Associates wrote. But they send me the texts, and I must figure out how to make them work in my classroom. This is always interesting, especially when you get pamphlets like "An advice to those who are drinkers of spirituous liquors." Do you need that for a 7-year-old? I don't think you do. So sometimes I have to figure it out with what I'm given. But for the most part, of course, I would never speak ill of my trustees or the associates. I like my books. Hope that answers your question.
Ms. Wager, we thank you deeply for our conversation that you've allowed us to have this afternoon. It's been enlightening for all of us here with you and all of us at home as well. This being said, we should end with one final question. And that is that we have several guests watching who may have never visited Williamsburg, but who might in the future, and might continue this conversation on their own. As our guests continue to learn more about women and their education, what is one thing you would like them to keep in mind?
Above all, I would wish you to keep in mind that the idea of woman is not a monolith. In the same way that you wouldn't expect every man has the same kind of education or experience, you should neither expect it of women. And therefore, while I can give you some broad and sweeping generalizations in my many years of experience, you ought ask me and others in Williamsburg not only their thoughts on education, but how they were educated. Go and speak to Mrs. de Rosario as much as me. Speak to both of us at the same time. Trust me, you'll get a very interesting conversation. But I encourage this above all else, for you cannot understand education of women if you don't look at the specific as well as the general. I hope that this answers your final question, and you must excuse me, because I really do need to get back to practicing my lessons for tomorrow.
This program has been made possible by a generous grant from Ferguson Enterprises.